three sections of stuff to wrap up 16th century art. In other words, the Renaissance and its aftermath, to make up for our class last week. And that runs about the same amount of time as the class itself would. There's also a new art fix on Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, and I'll be putting up a couple of worksheets as well for that. But one of the things that we saw in those, just very briefly, because this sets the stage for what we'll talk about today, is that after around 1520, the sort of balance and perfection and idealization of the Renaissance starts to go all crazy, right? Starts to get upended. And so, where Raphael had balanced everything with these sort of perfect triangular pyramid-like forms with a perfect landscape that goes back in distance in a rational, unified fashion, it disappears. And we start to see crazy anatomies, awkward crowding, a lack of balance. Notice these aren't points for toes, right? Strange spatial conceptions. That little guy in the background. Now, the painting's not finished, but Parmigianino was not going to make him any bigger. But you'll notice that based on the shadow, it looks like he's right behind her, her little plinth there, that little stand that she's on. But he's so much smaller. There's no unifying space. And sort of the crowding comes through with the Jesus almost like sliding off her lap, right? Having these tiny little arms and small head and feet and big wide midsections, In fact, the Madonna is exactly the same shape as that pot on the left, which is probably on purpose, right? Because she is often referred to as a pure vessel. Right? But this is, and that leg, right? That dancer's leg. It looks like something from the Rockettes or something at Christmas time. But it doesn't attach to the body, right? It's like if you follow the hip bone, it like comes into the navel. There's just no way to make that body work. In your mind, it's disunified. And historians began to look at this late Renaissance art, and they realized it was so artificial that it needed a different name. It wasn't really Renaissance art as we'd like to define it, like Raphael. And the term we came up with in the 1920s was mannerism. I say we, I'm not that old, right? But the term that historians came up with in the 1920s is mannerism. Because it's very mannered, it's very artificial, right? As opposed to the sort of perfect realism of Renaissance art. And online we looked at 2 or 3 of these works where the colors are unnatural, hot pink, come on, right? And mustard yellow and lime greens with orange shawls, where the space is crowded, where the ground seems to tip up for no apparent reason, and the structure of the composition is built around an opening in the middle rather than a solid. The body of Christ being borne toward his tomb. The torso looks fine, the legs look fine, but they don't look good together. The torso's way too big. The arm is too small for that torso as well, and the way it torques around, the way it bends, it's very hard to make sense of. The figure holding his shoulders, also. Nice legs, nice torso, not together, right? The legs are too short for a torso that long. And again, it's very hard to articulate. The figure holding his legs. If he's supporting something, he's not in a very good position to do that, right? He's teetering around on the points of his toes. So all of these things are sort of hallmarks of mannerist art. It's very strange by comparison to Renaissance art. And it became such a prominent style that even some of our proponents of Renaissance art, like Michelangelo, who lived all the way to the 1560s, also gets kind of swept up in mannerism as well. So, whereas the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which would be up over, I guess the creation of Adam would be about where the projector is, right? That's where the Sistine ceiling is, up on the top of your head, right? And that was like a hallmark of Renaissance art. It was as perfect could be. And then 25 years later, right? He's working in a much more mannerist style. There's no space here, for example, right? It's just kind of a curtain of figures that hangs down, all in sort of one plane. And it's crowded everywhere. It's weird everywhere. The bodies are strange. And again, this is discussed online, right? The women look like WWF wrestlers with breasts, you know? Figures seated on the clouds look like they don't have enough space to actually sit there, and there's often is not just sliding off of these things, right? And Jesus in the middle has, again, that torso body parts that don't really line up anymore, right? So this is all sort of hallmarks of mannerist art, this late phase of the Renaissance. Now, what caused all of this is something I didn't really talk about, and it's very difficult to talk about cause and effect. Why did these artists go off in this different direction? And on one hand, there is almost always I think in society in general, there's a tendency to react against your parents. You know, they're going to go this way, I'm going to do this, right? And in art, that's particularly strong, where one generation will react against what a previous generation had been doing. And so at a certain point, Parmesan, may have felt that there was some, need for something new, something different, something exciting. And I kind of like mannerist art. I use all these disparaging terms, but I find it rather kind of enjoyable because it's so weird, right? But there is this idea that, you're not going to do what Dad did. And we can say Dad, because they're all male artists at this point anyway, right? They're not going to do the same thing Dad did. That doesn't account for something like Michelangelo, however, who kind of reacts against his own work, in a way, and moves in a different direction. So it's very hard to explain, and that's one way we can possibly do it. Another thing that we can possibly look at is the turmoil that gripped a lot of Europe in the middle of the 16th century. The mannerist style kicks in around 1520 or so. We start to see it, not everywhere at once. It's not like all of a sudden they turn the page and everybody's doing something different. But we start to see mannerist art creep in around 1520. And a couple of things coincide with that. On the one hand, Leonardo's dead. Raphael is dead. Right? So the previous generation of artists isn't there anymore. Michelangelo lives forever. Titian lives forever. He's discussed online. But the other thing, more important than that, is social history. 1517, Martin Luther. The Protestant Reformation. Authority is challenged throughout Europe. It's a time of uncertainty everywhere in Europe. And the Catholic response to Martin Luther, for the first quarter century, almost 25 years, the Catholic response to Martin Luther was, ignore him and he'll go away. Right? Don't pay it any mind. And these Protestants will just disappear on their own. Right? Now, that's almost never good advice. You need, if something's, out there contesting your ideas, you need to address it. Right? So, mannerism seems to coincide with this new era of uncertainty. Is that a cause and effect? Probably not. But it's hard to ignore the fact that at the moment that European politics and society has been upended, the perfection and rationality of the Renaissance also seems to dissipate. Things go away, right? In lieu of something new. Now, Michelangelo's work on the left is kind of at the center of this. It's really in the middle of this storm. Because it was commissioned by Paul III, Pope Paul III, who was the Pope who started the Catholic response to Luther. Luther began the Protestant Reformation. Paul III, beginning in 1543, began the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic attempt to reform from within, to actually give its response to Luther's protests. Right? Luther's protest is why we call it the Protestant movement. Yeah? It began under Paul III, and Paul III was the money behind the Sistine Chapel judgment scene. And it's all about the authority of the church. Christ in judgment. St. Peter, the first pope, right there, pleading with Christ for the damned souls on this side. He is casting all of his attention on the damned, turning his back on the saved. Right? It's really all about, like, you know, it's so interesting, because when I was a teenager, it's interesting, probably still finding out this, that Christ is coming back, and boy is he pissed. Right? That's kind of what this one's all about. He's not forgiving Christ. He's not welcoming the saved into heaven. He is actively saying, get away from me. Right? And it can be seen as part of the statement with the Counter-Reformation. Like, you sinners out there, we're the only ones that get to make judgment. We, the Catholic Church. Right? I'm not even Catholic, I say that. Right? I'm speaking as if I were Michelangelo or Pope Paul III. Right? So, this lies at the heart of the Counter-Reformation. And what's interesting is that while Michelangelo's work is inspired by the beginnings of the Counter-Reformation, the Counter-Reformation also would cause the end of mannerism. Because one of the things that they did, the first thing that they did, right, was to convene. Here, I got a nice detail. Why am I talking about that? I could be showing him, right? Jesus showing his side and this very awkward body, right? Again, this sort of terror of these figures that we have, right? And again, everything about it being very, very manneristic. There's our crowded figures that we talked about before, right? Now, one of the things the Counter-Reformation did in order to try to solve the problems that Luther brought up, try to reunify the church, was that they convened a series of councils, series of conventions, where theologians would gather together and figure out exactly what was the Catholic position with respect to anything, right? And they met in the city of Trent. So it was called the Council of Trent, right? And I should have this up on a slide. For some reason, I don't think I do, at least not this way. The Council of Trent. This is a fairly prominent moment in European history, right? The Council of Trent. This is the Counter-Reformation gathering of theologians to figure out, put in writing, what was the official position on various issues. Okay? And the Council of Trent convened in 3 different sessions. And they lasted over 20 years. Right? The first council was done in 1542, the last one 1563. I forget the second one. Right? They didn't meet regularly over the course of 20 years, but from the beginning of this movement, the Counter-Reformation, to the end of its beginning, was a 20-year span. Okay? And they got together to determine sort of every unfair question from within. This is our position. Okay? At the third session, in 1563, they got around to the question of mercy. And they began to address exactly what should Catholic art be all about. And one of the things that they talked about was Michelangelo's Last Judgment. Because there were some things in it they did not like. It was a very unpopular work when it was first made. The biggest thing that was unpopular about it was the nudity. Michelangelo loves the human body. Go back and look at those online discussions of the Sistine Ceiling. He just loves big, powerful, muscular, perfect human bodies. Right? And he sees them as a perfect allegory for the human soul. Envision the soul as the body. Now, the normal tradition, when you see saints gathered around Christ, because these are all the saints of heaven up here. These are the souls of the saints rising here, being passed down over here below. But up above, this is the heavenly host. Right? And on the north, they're clothed when we see images of the Last Judgment. But not to Michelangelo. And in fact, as soon as Michelangelo died, 1564, which is just at the end of the last Council of Trent, where they determined what art should look like if it's religious art, they painted over most of the nudes. Right? Some of these were cleaned off. Only in right? So for 300 plus years, 400 plus years, it had overpainting. Not by Michelangelo, but by somebody else to make it proper. Right? In fact, when they cleaned it, they even left some of the clothing on some of the figures. This figure here was originally new. St. Catherine looks a lot like that, right? But you can still see her breast underneath in the tent. She was martyred on a spiked wheel, right? As part of her torture. Everybody's carrying the implement by which they were tortured. Some of the nudity has been covered up. Some of it has been cleaned away. Michelangelo had more than you see here, and this was part of the problem. It was not appropriate to the subject matter. And so as they're weighing in on anything that might affect Christian theology, in the last meeting of the Council of Trent, they get around to the idea of art. Right? And they're going to determine exactly what Christian art should be like. Right? Now, art has always been a problem for devout Christians. Because an artist creates, and an artist that works with a human figure creates man. That makes the artist like God, rivaling God in a way. In addition to that, if we go back to the Ten Commandments, the second one said, make no carved images. Where these engraved, right? And that was taken to mean not only carved images, but painted images, drawn images. And he doesn't just say, don't do humans. It talks about you don't do the things that live in the air, the things that live on the land, the things that live under the sea. Right? No carved images. And this is why Islam today turns its back on imagery. Judaism turns its back on imagery. Representational imagery. Right? That's why many artists, when they try to make spiritual work, turn toward abstract art instead. Because of that, right? Because of that commandment. Okay? So, it's always been a sticky wicket. The idea of art. How does art work within Christianity? And the Council of Trent is going to try and solve it. And they're going to come up with a series of proclamations about exactly how religious art should look. What it should try to do. Right? So what the Council of Trent says is that basically art is a good thing because art helps people who can't read to understand spiritual ideas. The mysteries of faith can be explained through pictures. I like to think this is a great thing, even outside the church, that there's a place for visual communication. There's things you can communicate with images that you cannot communicate with words. Right? But they see this in a very religious sphere. That for those who can't read, imagery becomes the Bible of the illiterate. And if imagery's primary purpose is to teach, then it needs to adhere to a few basic rules. Right? It needs to be realistic. And in being realistic, it needs to be accurate and appropriate. Okay? You can't read it, doesn't matter. Right? So realism. Right? But an accurate kind of realism, an appropriate kind of realism. Now they're pretty loosey-goosey with the accurate here. We're going to see a lot of people from the time of Christ dressed as if they were 17th century people. That was okay because it helped to get the message across and made it understandable. Right? Second thing, clear and simple. It's almost as if they're looking at mannerism and saying, we do not want that. They want things that people can understand and understand quickly and easily. Immediately intelligible. Right? That's the second thing. Right? The third thing is that it should try to stimulate a sense of piety. Stimulate religious thinking. And they recommended that the best way to do that was to have an art that appealed to your emotions. That was dramatic. Right? Got you engaged with it. So no more of these confusing things that you need a guidebook to figure out. Right? Simple, realistic, and emotional. That's what the Council of Trent said art should be. And this is very much a reaction to mannerism. Okay? And that means that after the Council of Trent, from the end of the 16th century, right after 1563 onward, we start to see art shift again. To try to keep up, particularly religious art, to try to keep up with these new guidelines. Right? Realistic, accurate, simple, and emotional. So when we get into the 17th century, we see the effects of the Council of Trent. Right? This new style that is more simple, more dramatic, more realistic. Right? Caravaggio is perhaps the best proponent of this. And by the way, those rules apply primarily to religious art. Right? And as you might imagine, they take hold first in Italy, because that's where the papacy is, right? So here's the moment when Christ calls St. Matthew to be one of his followers, right? And you can see that it's no longer busy, it's no longer overcrowded, it's not hard to read except for that dramatic lighting, which is very emotional, right? That spotlighting adds to the emotional quality. And that does obscure some things. It's not like Leonardo. It's not, sfumato lighting. It's different from that. But it's there to add to the sense, because Christ is coming in from the right. Christ is the light of the world. And the room is flooded with light from the direction that he comes. And it's the moment he calls St. Matthew to be one of his followers, and the light falls full face on St. Matthew, the bearded fellow at the table. And you can read it very clearly as well, because Christ points at him. And you can barely see that lick of his halo there. The fellow in front of him is one of his apostles, probably St. Andrew, who is a fisherman, realistic and accurate. He looks ruddy. He looks like a guy who spends his day out there getting his face beaten by seawater. Matted hair, dirty feet. Caravaggio got in some trouble for his dirty feet because he didn't like it being that realistic. Yeah? But he's pointing. St. Andrew is trying to follow his leader. Right? He's pointing as well in a very similar way. Matthew's going, you mean me? Right? He's pointing, he's almost trying to follow it as well. It's all really easy to read if you know a little bit about the subject matter. Right? It's all about using that dramatic light to tell the story. And also using it to simplify the composition. It's not full of things that aren't necessary. There are no, what do we see in one of the online things? There's no sort of doves in the corner canoodling or masks laying there or figures who have bodies that are made up of lions and snakes or anything strange like that. It's straightforward. Now the realism sort of stops with St. Andrew's feet. The figures are all dressed as if they are 17th century figures. Those are contemporary clothes. Because part of what the Council of Trent said is they wanted it to be immediately understandable. And thus, if we're going to figure out what's going on in the scene, we've got to see people, not archaeologically, but in a way that we can recognize them. What did Matthew do? Does anybody know what Matthew did before he was a follower of Christ? What was his job? At the moment that Christ calls him and says, give that up, come and follow me. Does anybody know what Matthew did? No? He was a banker. Right? And so at this particular moment, we see them counting money on the table. Matthew is in the middle of these people counting the taxes that they've collected. Right? So, in order to understand this, we need these contemporary clothing. So they're dressed very nicely, and make it out like bandits. I hope there's no finance majors We can use that stereotype. It even existed in the 17th century, that people who were interested in money were bad. Remember the Quentin Mackay picture of the money changer with his wife? Right? How that was this allegory for good versus bad, right? Being too interested in the things of the world. And we text Matthew at the exact moment when he's no longer interested in the money and he's starting to become interested in Christ. Right? So what Caravaggio has done is to choose this dramatic moment, the moment of conversion. Right? It's a climax moment. Right? It's not one of those moments when nothing's going on, when you're thinking the movie's getting kind of dull. Right? This is the moment of change. Right? A moment of drama. And it follows all of these precepts that have come from the Council of Trent. Now, historians, again, recognizing that there's a difference in style, right? Moving from mannerism into something very different, have come up with a term for this period. Artists of the Renaissance called themselves Renaissance. That was their term for themselves. It was a self-defined movement. Artists in the 17th century did not call themselves Baroque artists. But we as historians have labeled this period, the wider 17th century. It doesn't start in 1601. Right? The wider 17th century as the Baroque period, succeeding the Mannerist period, returning to some of the ideals of the Renaissance, some of the sense of balance, but with a greater sense of drama, right? With a greater sense of emotionalism. That moves us away from the confusion, the busyness, the crowdedness, the instability of the Mannerist period. And here's my little thing. So there's the Council of Trent. So you'll have it on the PowerPoint if you want to review online. Right? There's the Council of Trent that I wrote up on the board. That's where this is all coming from. Okay? And Caravaggio is probably the single best artist working in the style of as dictated by the Council of Trent. So there is Christ. And there is St. Andrew. And you'll notice that Andrew's hair is uncombed, his face is weather-beaten, his hands are stubby. He's a working-class guy. He's a fisherman, after all. Right? And he is doing his darndest to follow Christ. You'll notice that as Christ points to St. Matthew, Andrew does the same thing. And the hand is in the same pose to show you visually and clearly follower of Christ. Right? And he's got the light of Christ at his back, a walking stick there. If we look closely at the hand of Christ, do you recognize that hand? We've seen it somewhere before. God's hand in Adam, and actually it's more like, I think it's more like Adam's hand, but backwards. Right? But yeah, the God's hand, you notice God's fingers up a bit more. It's really significantly more like Adam's, isn't it? But in reverse. Now there's a good chance you might have known Prince after this, which would have given it to him in reverse. But remember that theologically speaking, we've mentioned this before, Christ is the new Adam, right? He is here to solve the problems that Adam brought to this world. So Caravaggio certainly knew Michelangelo's work. Everybody did, right? And is using that as the basis for his. I should mention as well that Caravaggio's first name is Michelangelo. So he would have been not only known as but sought out the greater Michelangelo's work. These hands, like I said, are the key to the composition. We've got bags of money here. We've got inkwell with the ledger books to be writing the accountant. And there is St. Matthew with a hand posed somewhat similar, pointing to himself. Are you sure you mean me? You'll notice he's even rearing back a bit, right? Almost like he's shocked as the light comes through the wall. And he kind of sits over on his right haunch because he can't believe this. He's not really quite ready to accept it yet. That adds to this sense of drama. In laying out the composition, Caravaggio uses that flood of light from the upper right to give you the sense of revelation. So the closer we are to Christ, the more people recognize him. Right? And we're working our way to Matthew's recognition. So there are two figures on the right of Matthew, two figures on the left of Matthew, the ones on the right have heard Christ come in. They see him. They're starting to get it, right? At least they are acknowledging his presence here. The ones on the left-hand side of St. Matthew are not paying any attention at all, right? So there's this phase across the five people at the table of moments of recognition, right? This all adds to the drama. Right? Now, this is inspired, like I said, by Counter-Reformation ideas about how art should look. And Caravaggio was by far the best at making works of art that fit those precepts. And almost all of his works have this dark brown tonality, highlighted primarily with yellows and reds. A few greens here and there, but even those are muted. Everything is in earth tones, and that's typical for Caravaggio. He became probably the most influential artist of the 17th century because his works fit so well this new idea about art. And everywhere we look, beginning in Italy, but everywhere in Europe, we see the influence of Caravaggio. He's such an innovator that everybody picked up his style. Some of them are a little hard to even distinguish from Caravaggio. And sorry for the squeamish out there. This is our R-rated gore movie section. Artemisia Gentileschi, our first woman artist. It's unfortunate that the first woman artist we talk about is a follower of Caravaggio. She's quite good in her own right, but she definitely adopts quite a bit of her approach to painting from Caravaggio. Again, think back to the Council of Trent. Simple and direct, right? Highly emotional, accurate, and realistic. Artemisia is all of those things. She also has Caravaggio's sense of dramatic lighting, coming from off-camera, if you will, outside the frame, flooding the scene. Lighting like this is often good to enhance drama. Filmmakers do it still today. Right? It simplifies the composition. We don't pay attention to the things in the background. We pay attention to the human interaction in the foreground, which is obviously also at a very dramatic moment. Judith is cutting off this guy's head, and she's right in the middle of sawing it off. Right? He's still alive. It's a horrific picture. Right? This is a scene from the Old Testament. And Judith was one of the children of Israel being held captive by Holofernes in, where was he? Persia, I think. And as he had his captives brought before his throne to look at the people he had captured, he saw Judith and fell in love with her, this daughter of Israel. And she did not want to marry him because obviously he's holding her people hostage, and then she realized that she could maybe rescue them. So what she did was she decided that she would offer to marry Holofernes, get him really, really drunk at their wedding, and use this as the opportunity to kill him and set the children of Israel free. Right? So we see here the wedding night. Judith and her servant, at the moment they're cutting off Holofernes' head. Right? A scene of triumph for the Israelites. Right? Poor Holofernes, dead drunk and just about dead here. Right? Blood everywhere, spurting, running, sprinkled across her chest. He's fighting with his last strength against them. Right? But look at the Caravaggio elements. Right? And now granted the blood is there, so you need it for that, but we have this darkened sort of earth tone highlighted by yellows and reds as the basic tonality of the picture. That's something that came out of Caravaggio's work. Something that Artemisia also picks up on. Caravaggio did this same scene. It was quite popular because of its high-keyed sense of drama. And I always thought this made a really nice comparison because it's such a different approach to this theme, right? Artemisia's Judas is kind of determined. She's kind of into it, you know? The strength necessary to do this, to hold him down, she's rather sort of adding some muscle, if you will, to the action. She's got him by not just, the hair, but part of the long beard as she holds him down. Caravaggio's Judith seems a little bit more detached, doesn't seem to quite get it. Her handmaiden isn't really helping. She's just there with the bag, to take the head later. Whereas Artemisia is sort of this, women together fighting against the horrible power of Holofernes. I don't want to necessarily say that it's a woman's take on the picture, but there definitely is a different way in which the two of them have each sort of conceived of this. Right? Now, it's tempting to put biography into Artemisia's work because Artemisia had a rather horrifying upbringing. It had nothing to do with her parents, per se. She wasn't born the daughter of another painter, Orazio Gentileschi. We have an Orazio in the National Gallery downtown. We'll talk about that in just a second, but that's her father. And he was responsible for her training and ran a studio where other artists came to paint as well. One of them raped Artemisia, and she took him to trial for having been raped by one of her father's colleagues. And the trial basically got him off scot-free, right? He was found guilty but fined nothing, right, and let go. And Artemisia was, as you might imagine, quite upset by this. And it seems, as we look at her pictures, that quite a few of them are women's revenge. So it's tempting to look at these works as being part of a autobiographical exorcism of demons that plagued her. At the same time, this kind of biblical drama, because nothing gets your emotions going better, nothing gets you engaged more, makes something more memorable than a little bit of gore. You can't forget having seen it. And that fits with the Baroque period. That fits with what the Counter-Reformation said art should be like. So it's not entirely just autobiography that inspires her. Other artists were doing the same thing, like Caravaggio. Now, her father is just as influenced by Caravaggio as Artemisia was, Orazio. On the right, we see Caravaggio lighting, coming in from outside the frame, raking diagonally through the composition. Artemisia doesn't show us a shadow on the back wall, but you can tell that the light is coming from the upper left. Whereas Orazio's is also coming from the upper left and illuminating the back of this lute player. Right? This is a genre scene, a scene of everyday life. Not a religious scene, but still done in this Counter-Reformation style, in this Baroque style, influenced by Caravaggio. The subject matter of the lute player is something Caravaggio did on a couple of different occasions. Orazio knew these works and is doing his own version of them. And again, we can see how the light streams in from above on the diagonal, rendering the scene more dramatic even than it really is. Both of these are meant to reach out to you. Both of them are saying to you that, hey, one of these musical instruments is here for you to play. You can join in the concert. Right? Each of them give us a violin with its neck reaching toward us and an unused violin bow with the music legible. Right? These are asking us to participate. They're asking us to engage. And that fits with this idea of an emotionally engaging work. Right? These are, in fact, physically engaging. As far away as Holland, we see some of the impact of Caravaggio, although altered somewhat. Again, another musical party, very erotic, very engaging, The figures in the midst of this. There's no music instruments for us to play, but maybe the guy in the back in the purple is telling us how we should engage, right? Have a drink, enjoy the song, participate in the image. Still brightly lit from the upper corner so that all of the figures are highlighted. A little different in that the background isn't as dark and the foreground is significantly more colorful. But we're definitely still seeing the impact of Caravaggio here. I love that figure in purple because it's almost like he's in on something. He's telling us not to tell anybody. Like, shh, don't tell people what's going on. And part of me thinks that what he's doing is he's taking a peek down the dress of that lute player in front of him. Don't tell her that I'm back here. You know, don't tell her that there's a little bit of fun to be had at someone else's expense. The two figures in the right corner also coming in to engage just as you are from the front. So here we're in Holland, as far away as it could possibly be, a Protestant country no less. Right? But we're still seeing the influence of Caravaggio reaching everywhere. Hans Horst, the artist, spent some time in Rome, had seen some Caravaggios, went back to Holland, and took this radical new style with him. Everywhere we look in Europe, every single country, we can find artists whose works are influenced by Caravaggio. Valentin de Boulogne, a French artist, as you might tell from his name, showing some card players who are apparently cheating as they play cards. This is a theme that Caravaggio also did, and Boulogne is simply doing a new version of the same. Right? The impact of this one artist everywhere, because he nailed it. He figured out exactly what the moment, what the time needed, and gave it to them in not only religious works, but in everything that he did. I love the look of the guy with the gloves missing his fingers, right? With the card cheats here. Imagine what he can do with the cards. Looking down at him that way. Another French work, and one of my favorite works from the National Gallery, Georges Delatour, shows Mary Magdalene at the moment that she figures out her new life. Mary Magdalene, you remember from Roger Vandervine's work, was originally a prostitute. She wears a slinky nightgown here. But she's looking into her mirror with her hand on a skull. And she's reflecting. Get it? The mirror is a symbol of reflection. She's reflecting on her past life. She's reflecting on her future. And this is the moment when she's going to recognize her salvation. Recognize her need to change her life. Right? And Delatour uses this Caravaggio lighting. Again, deep darkness with spotlighting on the figure. In this case, he likes to do this quite a bit. He includes the candle in the image, something Caravaggio I don't think ever did. Right? But it's right behind the skull that we can see in the mirror. So it's almost like Delatour is asking you to spend some time looking at the skull, the reminder of death, and thinking about your future, and whether or not, like Mary Magdalene, you too might be thinking about the path you're taking, and whether or not it's going to get you where you want to go. So, Caravaggio's everywhere, right? We can't get away from him. He's figured out a new way of painting, a new style that's easily recognizable, and most artists are responding to elsewhere. Spain is one of the places where we see Caravaggio's style the most obviously. Giuseppe de Rivera also spent time in Rome. He gives us this extreme close-up. Caravaggio liked close-ups. Bright highlighting coming in on the diagonal, and earth tone that establishes all of the colors in the piece, with only trickles of yellow and red offsetting the brownish tone of the entire work. St. Bartholomew was skinned alive for his faith. Again, high drama. We see the moment when he's been strung up They're sharpening the knife. They're about to slay him, right? Pull off all of his skin. He looks up in utter peace toward God, knowing that God will be faithful to him, that there will be a reward for the pain he's about to endure. Rivera focuses us on the skin, right? Gives us a sense of that to remind us what's coming down the pike. Right? So, Caravaggio's everywhere, right? He comes up with a new style that fits this new Baroque period, that answers the call from the Council of Trent on what art should truly look like. And it's so successful in answering those mandates that other artists pick up on it throughout all of Europe, particularly in the Catholic countries. We see Caravaggio's influence far and wide. Now, he's not the only game in town. In fact, if one were to ask who's the most important, or I don't know, Caravaggio is the most influential. But Gian Lorenzo Bernini, man, if you get a chance to see his stuff live, it's fantastic. Just fantastic. He painted as well. He was an architect as well. But the majority of his best-known works are in sculpture. And he brings to sculpture what Caravaggio brings to painting, a sense of drama, right? A sense of emotionalism, a sense of engagement, a sense of realism, of simplicity, that fits also this Counter-Reformation interest in a new kind of art that can instruct. So look at these side by side. So this is how the Baroque is different from the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance is all about balance and proportion and perfection. And when we look at Michelangelo's days, one of the things that came up from it is that you can't tell what moment of the story it is. There's nothing there to indicate where we are in the narrative. Right? Has he already thrown a rock at Goliath? And he's ready to throw another one. Is it the moment after he's cut off? There's nothing there to tell us. We've got the sling, he's got a rock in his hand, but we don't know where it is. Look at Bernini. He gives us a very particular moment, a very precise moment. And it's not like Donatello's David, which we've seen before, right? Where it's going afterwards, the drama's done, right? The work here is done, and he's fiddling around with his toes and blood and neck and viscera and all that. This is a very particular moment before. He's about to wind up, as it were, about to start to sling that rock. And everything is tight around that idea of slinging that rock. A very particular action-filled moment. High drama. Even David doesn't know whether or not he's going to be a success. In addition to that, one of the things that Bernini is really good at with his sculpture is getting you to engage. We talked about that with some of the other pictures we saw, that they reach out and say, hey, you have a role to play in this, right? Bernini's David is twisting around his core, right? The body opens sort of to your right. It hits toward us, but the back leg over and opening to the right. And then the body twists to the left, and the sling as we move back sort of beckons us to walk all the way around it. Michelangelo's David, you always see from this point of view for a reason, right? And the only way it looks kind of crappy from the back. It doesn't look too great from the side, but for me, David, asks you to engage, asks you to walk around the thing. Find out if he looks good from the side. What does he look like from the back? What does he look like from the other side? You become an active participant in the work. And that's kind of nice. Michelangelo's art, they were all about being a mental participant, right? Leaving things unfinished, darkening things with sfumato. That got you engaged mentally. But Baroque artists get you engaged physically. Play music. Your ears, eat some fruit that's on the table. Walk in the space of the sculpture. All of this is a different way of engaging with it. It's more active and visceral. It's emotional. And it has to do with the Council of Trent. So I'm going to animate this because I got a chance. I saw this last year for the first time. I've been teaching history of art for almost 30 years. I finally got to the Borghese Gallery in Rome. And I had it. That's, by the way, a Caravaggio in the background. See the head? But anyway, I got a chance to see it. So we're going to walk around it here. All right. So I hope we're going to walk around it here. Let's see what happens. Yeah, there. And that's exactly what he does. He just makes you want to move, right? To see it from different points of view. To see whether or not there's a more pleasing view than simply the front view that you so often see. That's not the same thing that happens with Michelangelo's David. There's a proactive engagement with the work. With that in mind, you'll notice also that he gives the figure an amazing sense of determination, right? Michelangelo's David had this look on his face that was a little bit worried, but he's not kind of a man of action. He's a man of thinking. Bernini's David has wild hair, bites his lower lip as he's trying to figure out if he has enough strength to beat that giant, right? Looks over his shoulder, angry. It's all incredibly emotional. Yeah. Bernini's very young at this point. He's only about 20, and this is over life size. And you can see the degree to which he's capturing a particular moment in the story of David. Particularly dramatic moment in the story of David. And down at his feet, we can see that his toes even reach over the edge of the block that he's standing on, as if they're gripping it as he's about to chuck that rock. Right? All of these details. We have a sack full of rocks that he would have used. Down at his feet, we have his harp. Remember, King David was a musician, wrote the Psalms. No time for music now, right? Throw down the harp, the time for business is at hand, right? So he's including all these things that help to identify David, whereas Michelangelo's David is really nothing there except the swoon, right? He also clothed him, too, right? More proper for the biblical story than Michelangelo's interest in nudity. Now, this was commissioned by a cardinal in Rome, as where Bernini is living, Scipione Borghese, and the building that we're in is actually his palace in Rome, which is still there, full of the works of art that he collected. Cardinal Scipione Borghese. And the reason I'm bringing him into this story is that it was actually fairly important, Scipione Borghese was. He was the nephew of the Pope. And after he bought this work from Bernini, the Pope came to visit his nephew and saw it and asked, who is this sculptor that I've never heard of? This young sculptor Bernini. That Pope was Pope Urban VIII. And after he saw Borghese's David, he hired Bernini to become his court artist. And if you go visit Rome today, most of what you see is either by Bernini or influenced by Bernini. Urban VIII really redesigned Rome. And Bernini had a huge role to play in that. It was the David that got him the job. He began to work for Urban VIII and then worked for 2 more popes after that. Right? For the next 30 years, he's working for the papacy on various projects in Rome. Some of the most famous things in Rome are by Bernini. You go inside the Cathedral of St. Peter's. The canopy that's over the altar in St. Peter's is by Bernini. It's impossible to tell how big this is. Have anybody been to St. Peter's before on one of our study abroad trips? It's 100 feet tall. It's taller than Guyot Hall. Right? What's 100 feet? That's an 8-story building, isn't it? It's about right. 15 feet per story, give or take. Right? 7-story building. The figures at the top are 25 feet tall, right? And it's all made out of bronze. Some of it's been gilded. To give you a sense of scale, right? Here's some people that are looking for this, right? Here's the human head. That's all, right? And this is from a distance as well, which makes it less huge than it really is. So this is part of the stuff that Pope Urban VIII hired Bernini to work on. Various decorations, the completion of St. Peter's Cathedral. This sits directly beneath Michelangelo's dome. So overhead here, it comes almost to that level. Right? A little bit below that, up to that level from the ground. And directly beneath it is not only the altar of St. Peter's, but under that is the grave where St. Peter's buried. Right? This then rises above it. Now, it was normal over altars to have a cloth canopy, but Bernini gives us a much more dramatic bronze version, where things that look like cloth fringe, like the, here, let's do this. This bit here that looks like cloth fringe isn't cloth at all, but all cast bronze. Here's a close-up of the figures up above. And like I mentioned, those figures standing on the corner are 15, 20 feet tall, just to give you a sense of scale. Right? Covered with decorations everywhere we look. And again, dramatic. Look at those columns. They're not straight columns, but they twist on their axis, just like David had twisted on his axis. Everything is activated. Everything seems to be moving. Bernini went to work for other popes as well, and he's responsible for the square, the plaza outside of St. Peter's. Right? There was a long time working on the Cathedral of St. Peter's. It began around the time of Julius II. But the facade didn't go on until the early 17th century. The dome didn't go up until the late 16th century. And this area up front was simply open when Bernini went to work on it in the 1650s. Some of the buildings were already there, and the Sistine Chapel was here. Right? So it was difficult to figure out how he's going to fit in a square in a place where other buildings currently stand. Right? And he comes up with this new scheme of sort of having it not be perfectly square. So you'll notice that the arms come in as an angle towards the circle. The buildings here, which are part of this design, also repeat the angle of those two walls as well. It's impossible to tell scale here, unless you've ever been. Here's a panorama. I took Mary Lessons to Rome a year ago, just this month, and took this while we were there. But now we're standing inside of it to give you a sense of scale. Right? This is all Bernini's design to aggrandize St. Peter's. Right? So that one David statue gave him work for most of the rest of his career. Somebody asked Pope Urban VIII, aren't we lucky to have you as Pope? And he said, no, I'm the lucky one. I got Bernini working for me, right, helping me design all of this. The fascinating thing is the drama of the architecture. It's hard to think of architecture as having drama. But in working with this space and having those two side arms splay out as you move toward the facade, right? So it's narrower here than it is here, right? The trapezoid. That means if you stand here and look toward the facade, because the arms go out, it means perspective stops working in the way that we used to see it, right? So if we think about how perspective works, parallel lines get closer together the further they get away from you, right? The railroad track, the highway. But because those splay out, as perspective works, it makes the end of it look closer than it really is. It violates the perspective. Okay? So if you're standing in the square and you're looking at the church that you're making your pilgrimage to, the church looks closer than it is. Think about that metaphorically, right? The church is always closer. It's part of the message that he's using, right? He's using this architectural illusionism to bring the facade of St. Peter's closer than it might really seem. And if you finish your pilgrimage and you get to St. Peter's and look the other direction, perspective is heightened. Right? The world beyond the gate looks further away as well. Another wonderful sort of symbol. You've made it to sanctuary. You've left the world behind. And the world is further away once you get there. All of this enhanced by the way you look at the building through these choices that Bernini has made. So, a fantastic architect as well as a sculptor. Innocent X is the Pope who paid for St. Peter's Square. He's 30 years later than Urban VIII, the third of three different popes that Bernini works for. He did quite a few works for Innocent X, including decorating the square in Rome where Innocent X's family palace was located. So looking out onto this square, there was a fountain there. Already, Bernini is going to decorate it for for Innocent X. Right? The Washington's monument that you see, the obelisk, was stolen from Egypt by a Roman emperor, had been in Rome already for 1,600 years at this point. That is incorporated into this amazing fountain down below, the Four Rivers Fountain. This again would be looked out on from Innocent X's family palace, right? So multimedia drama, right? He's using not only stone but water as part of his medium, and using it to engage you. So what he's done is to show us all of the rivers of the earth, and I think that's meant as a metaphor. The Pope is looking out on this. The Pope has power everywhere. Each of these four rivers is meant to typify one of the four corners of the earth, right? The four rivers of the world, as a symbol of papal power. And there's something with each of the statues, each of them personifying one of the rivers, that helps us to identify which of the rivers they are. The one we're looking at here is the Danube River, which runs in Europe. And as you can see, the figure reaches up and touches a coat of arms. That coat of arms here is the coat of arms of the papacy. You can see the keys of St. Peter hanging from the coat of arms. The river that can touch the Pope, if you will, is the river closest to it, the Danube, the river through Central Europe. We move our way around the Ganges River in Asia, sits on a massive oar from a boat, because it was reputed to be the most navigable river anywhere, the deepest and the widest, which helps us then to identify. Again, Bernini's powerful, massive, and engaging figures sculpted here. The Nile River in Africa was referred to in the 17th century as the unknown continent, simply because it had not been as well explored as the others, at least from the European point of view, and so the Nile River has his head covered in a cloak. To typify that, to symbolize that. And then finally, for South America, or the Americas in general, the Rio de la Plata is laying on a bed of coins, which you see here, to symbolize the riches of the New World that can come back. All of this then meant to symbolize the far-reaching power of the papacy, right? To adorn the courtyard in front of the Pope's private palace in Rome. Now we have one more Bernini to look at, but we don't have the time for it. So we will pick up with this on Thursday, one of his most famous works, and move on to talk about Baroque art in other countries, beginning with Spain, but moving our way through Europe from there. So we'll continue with Baroque on Thursday. I'll get you back your bibliographies, the few of you that don't have them yet, and I'll check into the schedule that you asked me about insofar as insofar as those other things are concerned. Okay? So look for emails from me in the next day or so. All right?